AOC says it's time to ignore the courts, especially when she doesn't like their rulings. She was on with CNN, and Anderson Cooper was trying to get her to explain her position on this new ruling that came out. A federal judge in Texas issued a preliminary ruling invalidating the abortion pill, mifepristone. But AOC is very unhappy about that, obviously. And when she doesn't like rulings, she just says, don't pay attention to them. Here's her justification for that.
Already issued statements, for example, advising what we should do in a situation like this, which I concur, which is that I believe that the Biden administration should ignore this ruling. I think that the courts have the legitimacy and they rely on the legitimacy of their rulings. And what they are currently doing is engaged in an unprecedented and dramatic erosion of the legitimacy of the courts. It is the justices themselves, through the deeply partisan and unfounded nature of these rulings, that are undermining their own enforcement.
So you're saying the Biden administration should ignore this court, but what does that look like? What does that actually mean?
I think the interesting thing when it comes to a ruling is that it relies on enforcement. And it is up to the Biden administration to choose whether or not to enforce such a ruling.
But is that...
That's asking the courts to just be completely sidelined, telling the courts you're going to be sidelined. And somebody had a conversation with AOC. I know where this is coming from. It's the difference between legitimacy and enforceability. So you can issue a ruling out of a court, but what are they going to do to enforce it? We've talked a lot about court legitimacy and about legitimacy as being necessary to functional institutions in this country. And if you stop believing that the institutions are legitimate, people stop engaging with the institutions and the institutions just evaporate. One of the big problems when you have weaponized government, when you overly politicize prosecutions to go after political opponents, the prosecutor's office, in many people's eyes, continue to lose legitimacy. When the United States start stealing dollars out of bank accounts of foreign countries, they think, well, the dollar's not that legitimate anymore. They start making new trade deals. People disengage with things that don't have legitimacy. And AOC is saying that the people here should take the court's legitimacy and consider it to be evaporating because their rulings, according to her, are not in alignment with the country. This ruling is not in alignment with what the people want. Therefore, it should be ignored. And how does that play out? Well, she's asking the Biden administration to specifically not enforce it. The court can't enforce it. The court just makes the rulings, and then they rely on other branches of governments to do the enforcing. The legislative branch creates the law. The executive branch executes the law. And if there's a dispute about the law, the judiciary decides what the law is. And what AOC is asking is that the executive branch just not enforce the rulings from the judiciary. And when you have a situation like that, you start to run into a constitutional crisis where one party just does whatever they want in a totalitarian fashion because the checks and balances of the current system are no longer appropriate. Courts don't matter. They're in the way of our agenda and they should be forgotten. This is how they think. This is how they operate. They don't really care about democracy or about checks and balances or about a functional government. They're a lot more interested in just winning at all costs. And if their social agenda is being impeded by the pesky courts, so what? If their insurrection investigation is being interfered with things like due process or equal protection or the disclosure of exculpatory information or any other type of process that normally has limits and checks and balances on it, they don't care. The historical precedent of not indicting current candidates for president or former presidents like Donald Trump goes right out the window because they need to accomplish a goal. So it's a disturbing trend, but it's one that they are using very regularly. They'll constantly look at the right. They'll look at people who are so-called conservatives or MAGA ultra extremists or whatever they label people. But that side is not the side demanding that entire institutions be vaporized when they don't do things appropriately. They keep creating illegally constituted J6 committees. They keep breaking historical precedent. And now they're asking for the entire court system to be ignored. It's insanity, but they don't even get any pushback. Even Anderson Cooper's like, well, how are you going to do that? And she says, well, we're just not going to enforce it. Joe Biden is here. We're going to see what he does about it. He says a federal district judge in Texas ruled that prescription medication that has been available for more than 22 years and been used safely should no longer be approved in the United States. He says we're going to fight this ruling, which means he'll very likely appeal it and go through the judicial mechanisms, surely. But does this mean that he's not going to enforce it? Or he's going to issue an executive order or tell the courts to get bent? We do know how important abortion is to these considerations. A little bit more about the decision. Federal judge in Texas issued a preliminary ruling that invalidates this thing. We'll read through the opinion. Alliance for Hippocratic Medicine versus the US FDA, filed April 7, 2023. Here is the memo and the order. Granting the motion in part. They give us some background, the judge writes. Over 20 years ago, the FDA approved chemical abortion, and they're going to call it a 2000 approval to reference that era. They passed it 20 years ago, the year 2000, they're going to call it. The legality of the 2000 approval is now before the court. Why did it take 2 decades for this judicial review to happen? I mean, after all, the plaintiff's petitions challenging the approval in 2000 date back to 2002, right? Says the judge. Why is it taking so long? He says, well, simply put, easy. The FDA stonewalled the judicial review. They didn't let the courts come in here and do their job, which is to decide and say what the law is, until now. Now, before the plaintiffs here filed their case, the FDA ignored their complaints for over 16 years, even though the law requires an agency response within 180 days. FDA waited 4,971 days to adjudicate these claims and another 994 days to adjudicate the second. Had the FDA responded within the time allotted, this case would have been in federal court decades earlier, but they postponed and procrastinated for nearly 6,000 days. They say plaintiffs are doctors and national medical associations that provide health care for pregnant and post-abortive women and girls. Plaintiffs sued defendants to challenge multiple actions culminating in the approval of this drug. They give us some details about the drug, about how it works and what it does. It will not always complete the abortion because of this. FDA mandates a 2-step regimen. 1, mifepristone to kill the unborn human, which is this language from the judge. Interesting. And I think you'll get this. I've seen some criticism on this in the media about this already, saying it should be called fetus. How dare he use this word? Unborn human. Followed by another drug to induce cramping. So 1 to kill, 1 to expel is the process by which this works. And it's also known as RU486 mifepr. Okay, I'm going to skip all the pharmaceutical jargon. But in 1996, the council filed a new application for the drug. Shortly thereafter, the FDA reset from standard priority to a priority review. FDA noted it's going to be doing a bunch of things. Months later, the FDA approved the chemical regimen, commonly known as accelerated approval. So they're pushing it through quickly. This process only approves drugs that have been studied for serious and life-threatening illnesses. The FDA then imposed post-approval restrictions to ensure the safe use. Drugs were limited to women and girls with unborn children, 7 weeks and younger, required 3 in-person office visits to administer, and the abortionists were required to properly train and administer the regimen to report all adverse effects in drugs. And so another agency got involved, and at some point the FDA rejected a petition and increased some of the rules. 7 weeks got moved up to 10 weeks. Changed the dosage for the abortion. Reduced the number of in-person office from 3 to 1, right? So all the standards are going down. The rules are getting looser. Eliminated the requirement for prescribers to report non-fatal adverse events. The rules start changing. The bureaucrats want the abortions. They're like, oh, perfect. We got our foot in the door. Now we can start loosening the standards. In March, they were challenging the removal of these safety restrictions. They filed lawsuits, and the FDA just stonewalls them. 2 years later, FDA announced it would exercise another enforcement discretion, and they used COVID to extend all the things. More plaintiffs sued, and here we are. Compelling evidence suggests that the statistics provided by the FDA on the adverse effects of chemical abortion understate the negative impact of the chemical abortion regimen and what it does to women and girls. When women seek emergency care after receiving the chemical abortion pills, the abortionist that prescribed the drugs is usually not the provider to manage the mother's complications. Consequently, the treating physician may not know that the adverse event is due to mifepristone. Studies support this conclusion by finding over 60% of women and girls in emergency room visits after these chemical abortions are miscoded as miscarriages rather than adverse effects to the drug. Simply put, the FDA's data incomplete, potentially misleading, and they're manipulating the numbers. You're kidding. Would they do that? They talk about congressional involvement. They say in 2000, the FDA abandoned its safety proposals and acquiesced to other objections of Population Council and Danco. Despite its, quote, serious reservations about the drug's safety, using its language, the FDA approved a regimen that relied on self-certification that a prescribing physician has the ability to diagnose ectopic pregnancies. The judge says, if this case is not heard, there is substantial threat of irreparable harm. At least 2 women died from these drugs last year. Now, the FDA says these drugs have already been on the market for more than 20 years. The judge says that ignores many restrictions and safeguards. Those no longer exist. They were in place for most of that time. Foregoing reason, FDA's approval of the drug is stayed. Stays the applicability of this opinion in order for 7 days, allows the federal government to seek emergency relief from the Fifth Circuit, which of course they will do. Signed by Judge Matthew Kaczmarek, United States District Court judge. So long story short, the drug was passed and approved a long time ago with all sorts of conditions upon it in order to be dispensed. And then slowly but surely, the FDA just started whittling those away. There are many challenges to those. You can't change that without going through these processes. And we've covered many of these procedural lawsuits. The Administrative Procedures Act, APA, and all of those other things. Similar type of argument here, saying that you just slowly whittled those away. We've never had our day in court because the FDA kept doing basically what they did during COVID, with the CDC and other entities. Well, we need more time, more money, more money, emergency. And then finally, one judge is willing to hear it, says you can't do that, reverting it all the way back to the beginning, granting the preliminary injunction to remove the approval. And then there will certainly be a response from this. As we saw, AOC says, ignore it. Don't even have to pay attention to it. Forget about it. Just keep the drugs on the shelf. Nobody's going to do anything about it. And Joe Biden says that he's going to fight it. Whatever that means, of course, we will see.